How can the study of the evolution of music really help us understand the history of communities and cultures? Lisa Nielson's book on music and musicians in the early medieval Islamic period really opened my eyes to a whole new world. We know of the spread of Islam across West Asia and North Africa, all the way to Spain, starting the 7th, 8th, 9th century. But we rarely look at the period or the cusp between the pre-Islamic state and the Islamic state and the interaction therein. Lisa is a musician and a historian who studied music and its history. And she has opened up this fascinating world through her book, where she looks at music as the connector between these two periods and how it kind of shaped things to come. Lisa joins us from Cleveland. Lisa, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Meeni. I am so excited to be here and talk about this history that I'm in love with.
Right, Lisa, I was fascinated by it because, when you look at history, and here at Live History India, we try our best to look at the works of people like you from diverse fields and also look at history from multiple angles, through literature, through art, through artifacts, through now music. But I am going to ask you, what started first for you, music or the history of music? And how did you venture into this journey, especially covering this particular era and area?
So I grew up in a family of musicians. My father is a musician. He's a composer, actually. My mother was a singer. And music was everywhere in my house. We would sing together. We would play together. Even my grandparents would play and sing. And so there was a variety of music going on at all times. And it was expected that I was going to play something. I was kind of a tomboy, though. I mean, I wanted to play football, American football, but then my parents said, great, piano lessons start tomorrow. So my father was my first teacher, and I played piano as young people do. I was probably about 4 or 5. And, having the attention span of a 4 or 5-year-old, I did not progress terribly fast, but I did love playing, and I loved playing with my family, later on playing with friends. When I was in high school, though, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a musician or study medieval history. And so I took a year off before I went to college just to figure it out. And I played in my local symphony, and that was a wonderful experience. I even was 18. I had no idea what I was doing. I'd started cello when I was in high school after drifting through a few instruments. And then I wound up getting an undergraduate and master's degree in cello performance. But I kept trying to figure out, what did I love more? Was it music, playing it, or music, thinking about it in the history? And as you play, you get more interested in, like, why did they write this piece? Why is this like this? And so I just kept kind of nerding out on the history of music. And then eventually I started playing historical instruments. I play viola da gamba. I got interested in playing medieval music. And so I play some medieval bowed strings. And I actually spent part of my professional life being a Baroque player, and I still do some of that. So they kind of fed into each other. When I finished my master's, I went and worked in a different field, just thinking, okay, did that, let's try something else. And when I was in my 30s, I really wanted to finish this PhD thing. So I went back to school. I was 35, considerably older than that now. And I wanted to do music history, but I wasn't sure what. And so I originally had this grandiose plan to look at the interrelationships between East and West. And, so what were those influences? Because I was trained in the Western tradition. And then I learned, well, people have studied that. But in the course of figuring that out, I kept coming across stories about these singing women, especially in the medieval Islamic, which I knew nothing about because we don't really learn that. And I'm like, who are these singing women? And so one day I went to my advisor, who was a wonderful art historian, and I said, I keep coming across these singing women. They're everywhere, but nobody's really studied them. Everybody knows about them. He's like, well, then study the singing women. I'm like, okay.
Right.
And so
I'm going to stop you there, and I'm going to pick up this from this answer of yours and talk about Jamila, because you start your introduction with this very interesting woman who speaks to us through the mists of time, so to say. 8th
Mhm.
century, she's Jamila. She's making a trip from Medina to Mecca with a
Yes.
huge entourage of musicians, and they have a merry ride to Mecca. It's very hard to imagine and kind of put that in a time frame now. But tell us about Jamila and where this story came to you from. How did you discover the piece around Jamila?
So Jamila is on the border of the pre-Islamic into the Islamic world. Her name means the beautiful one. And people still name their children Jamila. I encountered her story before I really knew anything about this history in Henry George Farmer's book on the history of Arabian music, I think is the proper title. That was his thesis from 1929. And that was the only book I had on this history, especially history of music. So I'm reading about this woman. I'm like, I need to know more about her. And that was one of my singing women. And much of her story is in the Kitab al-Ghani, which is the Great Book of Songs, which is in 24 to 33 volumes, depending on which you have, written by Abu Faraj al-Isfahani from the 10th century. And it contains incredible stories of music and musicians throughout the medieval Islamic time up to the author's present, which is 10th century. So that's where the bulk of this story comes from. But she was powerful enough that that her stories about her pop up in other sources. So we find her noted in histories, usually in passing, because it was assumed everybody knows about Jamila. And she was one of the teachers of all of the next great musician generation, especially some of the first male singers, because music was predominantly a women's profession. And so she's credited with being one of the first musicians that was on the border, but then also teaching the first musicians in Islam at that time.
You refer to this book of music, of songs, so to say, in the 10th century. Now, Jamila was, I think, in the 8th century. Now, 8th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries when Islam spread. So I'm going to ask you about your source material. And you have put together a lovely collection of pictures which take you through this story of music in that very early period. So I'll hand it to you now, and tell us a story about it.
Yes. So there's music is mentioned in so many sources in medieval Arabic literature, but there are very few actual sources about music and musicians. So the Great Book of Songs is one of them. And it is the source. It has not been fully translated, though there are some fantastic studies of it. Hilary Kilpatrick has done incredible work on this book. I highly recommend her work. Dwight Reynolds has just published a fantastic translation of some of the major stories of several musicians, and it's just a highly engaging, wonderful read. It's a bit blue, actually. So there are very serious stories, and then there's some stories about, well, disastrous party moments, drinking, festivation, farting, burning, falling over drunk. I mean, all the things you do not necessarily think of when you think of medieval Islamic courts. And so Isfahani is one of the great sources. We do have a number of images that show up in illuminated manuscripts. There's a belief that art does not exist in Islam, but it does. There were several painting schools. People rendered musicians in frescoes, murals, plates. There are some beautiful renditions. So, for example, we're looking at a really large fresco that is in the National Museum of Syria in Damascus. I've actually seen this in person. This is not my image, but it was taken from a palace from the 8th century. And it's a little hard to see, but you can see one musician holding an oud or a lute and another one holding a flute, an aulos. And so a lot of these scenes are wrapped up in courtly scenes. We also have images of singing women and also singing boys who often dressed about the same. So when in a culture where everybody's wearing robes and has beautiful long hair, it's a little hard sometimes to tell who is who, but there was a cult of, well, I shouldn't say cult, it's not a really good term for it, but there was a fad for beautiful boys who served wine and beautiful women who served wine. Many of them were also enslaved. And so some of the images we see are of enslaved musicians and dancers. And so, for example, this is an image. One of my colleagues insists that these are probably beautiful boys, and other colleagues go, oh, they're probably women, because this was from a harem on the wall. Mostly the sensual pictures are going to show up in private spaces. So these are saki, they're wine pourers. Mostly a lot of the courtly wine pourers were young men. And young men were very appealing because they were beautiful. They did not yet have beards. They had all the appeal of men with masculine bodies, but also the appeal of women with smooth skin. So they would wear their hair in beautiful curls and ringlets. And there's a lot of poetry dedicated to beautiful men. So we have a little bit of gender bending going on in the courts, but women were the backbone of musical entertainments in these courts. So we have, for sources, then we have the Kitab al-Aghani, we have some practical tutors, we have philosophies of music such as by Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi, really diving into what we would call music theory. But a lot of the references show up in poetry, in literature, histories such as Al-Masudi and Al-Tabari. And so one has to triangulate a lot.
Right.
I found a lot of information just looking at some of these images, as well as reading.
I mean, they do give us a window into life and times then, and we will, of course, have many more visuals for you. But I'm going to quickly ask you, for our viewers, give us a sense of the geography that we are talking about. Which is the area that you're largely talking about? Because this is the early years of Islam. It's not a time when it is spread east into India, etc., but it's really in time and space, it is concentrated. So do tell us about that.
So my area of inquiry is mostly what we would now call the Levant and Arabia, what is now Saudi Arabia. The Abbasid Caliphate was from 750 to 1258. But kind of fell out of power by the 10th century. And so other dynasties came and went. But I am focusing in my work predominantly on what we now call Iraq, which is where Baghdad is. The Abbasids built Baghdad, Damascus in what is now Syria, and Jerusalem in what is now Israel and Palestine. The other major intellectual hub was Alexandria in Egypt. And we all know of the famous story of the library. But also Baghdad, Jerusalem, and Damascus had very important libraries. And some of those libraries are still, the footprint is still there. A lot of them would also be in schools, what are called madrasas, but also in the mosque. People kept texts, they heard lectures, they memorized entire books, including, of course, the Quran. And so scholars traveled among these intellectual centers to share knowledge, and they were also highly cosmopolitan. People came from all over the world into the center of the Abbasid Empire in order to learn, study, earn a living, and that included drifting bands of Sufi.
Right. We will come to the Sufis because that's a very interesting subculture within this. But I am going to talk to you about the early courts that you talk about, right? Because this is a time when new elements are being, it's a new faith, it's a young faith. It's spreading and also adopting and adapting to new cultures. So, and you have a whole chapter on the early relationships, whether it's matrimonial relationships that get new elements into a court or new adaptation. So tell us a little about that, because in your own words, music tells us the story of this evolution. And through the lens of music, you are looking at this early period.
Yes. And I sort of go from the standpoint that, music is a social construct as well as a relationship, right? We create music, we share music, and it is a mutual engagement between audience, performer, and patron. And so from antiquity, music was often, but not always, performed by enslaved women. And some cultures embraced male musicians, others didn't. And in the area in which I'm concerned, prior to Islam, men did make music, but it was socially uncomfortable for them to be professionals. And professional in this sense meant that you basically were visible and made your living as a musician. So with the advent of Islam, there were a lot of indigenous practices already. The Arabs have been called, and I'm using the term Arab very loosely here, a poetic people, and poetry was considered in antiquity the primary art form. Later, Islamic scholars, certainly in the medieval era, contested whether music even existed, but it did. Of course, humans are a sounding species. So there were a number of practices and instruments, including singing women, these sort of cross-gendered men called mukhanathun, who could potentially have been marriage brokers as well as entertainers. They were borrowing musical forms, styles, songs, poetry from, of course, Greece and Rome, and also India and Persia. So the merchants were traveling widely both before and after the advent of Islam, bringing all these different forms together into what later on become the Islamic states. And a lot of these things just continued. The use of singing women, use of instruments. Portable instruments were very important, of course, for nomadic groups. You don't really want to schlep a giant drum. And you also needed something that would be hardy and withstand the elements. So small drums, flutes, plucked instruments. Later on, we get as people become sedentary and the cities expand, we get more instruments coming in from other parts of the world. Slavery is a huge conduit for music. Much of the music that we have today was created by or supplemented by enslaved people. That's from the Americas to other countries. And so all of this kind of flows into the nascent Islamic states and then begins to form the basis for what later on becomes Islamic musical culture. And I should say, when I say Islamicate, this is a term that is used to describe the world in which Islam was predominant, but also all of the other systems that go into it. It was coined by Marshall Hodgson. And
that gets me to my next question, because when you look at the Islamic world, we in our minds are looking at a homogeneous unit. It is not a homogeneous. There was a lot of difference between Egypt and Baghdad, for instance. Alexandria and Baghdad, they were two totally different zones. Now, my question to you is, what is the research pointed to in terms of what were the instruments that were used or in vogue? Where did the instruments originate? Can you trace back elements from sitting in the vantage point of today, going back in time? Can you trace it back to regions?
A little bit. I mean, it's highly speculative. I mean, we know, for example, flutes and the aulos, which is the double flute that we see in Greek literature, that's everywhere. And so flutes, especially the sideways flute, the transverse flute as opposed to downward, that comes a little bit later. Every culture had a form of woodwind. Also, reed instruments tend to come from what we now call the Middle East. The lute is thought to have come from Persia, but later developed in other cultures. Mm-hmm. And so there are some consistencies in forms. The lute actually comes from the Arabic alut, because the hard ta sound to Western ear sounded like lute. And so that is actually oud. And it can have frets, it can have no frets. We have images of different kinds of species of lute, but some of these instruments were most definitely there. Some also were adapted, and that's a archaeology that is still ongoing, and this is where the images come in handy. So we do see here a flute player, and we see a lute player. The lute is also played with a plectrum. It's about yay long, and you strum like this, very much like a guitar pick, but it's got a different technique to it. So that's still a work in progress. I mean, we have accounts of these instruments and descriptions of, well, this came from these people, but we don't have extant instruments, and best guess is sort of triangulating through these tutorials and treatises that come from later periods and what people are already playing. This is one of my favorite images. I really like this one. It was actually shared with me by a journalist, and it is in the Israel Museum, and it's a Fatima de Krian, who is a courtesan, and she is holding a lute, and that which was the instrument of singing women in the courts, and so it's associated very strongly with them.
Right. Fascinating. Tell me, you mentioned the Sufis, and in India also we have a very, very strong strain of Sufis, different schools across from Kashmir to the Deccan, the two, of course, Delhi and Agra and Ajmer. But music plays a very big role over there. And we often see the Sufis as the connect between the faith and the masses. They helped spread the faith. How much of the Sufi music is part of the old pre-Islamic culture, that strain that came in? What is your analysis?
Such a great question. And my answer to that is it is less concrete music, like tunes and things like that, but more practice. And so there are many, many Sufi orders, and they are developing as music and Islamic law and all of these different, aspects of building blocks of what later on becomes medieval Islamic culture. And so there were very serious, what we would call sort of the sober Sufis who did not dance and did not have music. And they were quite chary of those who did. We have these antinomian orders who wandered around, and they were pretty scandalous. They would shave their beards and wear minimal clothing, and they played music and danced. And so the Sufi were of the people, bringing music as well as, news, gossip, and other things to the low, what we'd call the lower and middling classes, but they were also still operating at the upper echelons. So in my reading, and I'm not an expert on Sufism, is that they were all working, all of these different pieces were coming together, that the, recitation of Sufi was being heard in the mosque, and sometimes instruments were being played in the mosque, and that was bleeding into the streets. And then, but also then people were hearing music or beautiful recitation and bringing it in the other direction. And so there was not just sort of a trickle down of elite or scholarly practices into the lower classes, it was also coming up. And the Sufi were in the middle of all of that, and they were also a source of conflict. As a result, that a lot of people got very upset. It's like, look at what these people are doing. I mean, my God, they're playing music in the mosque. This is horrifying. What are we going to do? And so there are a lot of treatises about this. And so when censure about music comes in, the Sufi are the target.
So I'm going to ask you about the censure of music. When did it become bad to play music in the area? And how much of that has it got to do with the fact that, post the fall of Baghdad in 1258, when the Mongols come across and destroy Baghdad, raze it to the ground, you have, in most senses, the end of the golden period of Islam, so to say. Does it coincide with that? Does the orthodoxy seep in before or after that event?
It comes in early. The first sort of noted treatise that is what we would say sort of against listening, or sama, is written by Ibn Abul Dunya, and it's called the Dhamma Malahi, and it's basically the censure of instruments of pleasure. And so I kind of love this text. And so he is writing quite early. He is a 9th century writer. But we also have sort of injunctions by Al-Khalal, who was a major scholar, and he was a scholar of the Hanbali school, writing against listening specifically to music, because listening, of course, could cover a lot of things. We have earlier treatises around the 8th century that are saying, singing is okay, but only under certain circumstances. So there was concern early on, because music, and especially singing, was associated with paganism. And so within a monotheistic framework, that was a bad thing. We wanted, with the early days of Islam, people were trying to figure out what is allowable under religion. Well, the Christians and the Jews, who are similar to us, who are all people of the book, are not doing this. And so we should not do this either. because, the early Muslims were very much, trying to carve out the differences between the other religions, but also where were we similar? And so anything that sort of sniffed of paganism and sort of rival powers was suspect. But on the other hand, in order to have a powerful court, you needed to have entertainment. And so there was a conflict early on, and you see it early in the writing. Later on, religious scholars come in to weigh in, and there are many different takes on this. To some, completely listening to music was completely haram, just don't even go there. To others, it was like okay under certain circumstances, like maybe at a wedding. Nobody really could come down on a definitive answer. And so there's a variety of opinion about this, including among what we would sort of consider the more sober, it's often been put as sort of like anti as opposed to pro in Western discourses. And it really is a lot more complicated than that. There are more gray areas. And so even somebody like Ibn Taymiyyah would be no listening whatsoever. But if you're in nature, God created nature, so you should love nature and enjoy those sounds. So it gets harder and more arguments, both in, depending on where one stood later on. So by the 13th century, when we see the fall of Baghdad, the arguments are more sophisticated, both, on the we love music side and the we're a little worried about music side. And a lot of it was also in just reaction to excesses of the court, excesses of the Sufi, fear of foreign, influences that were going to dilute and lead people off the straight path. And so that discussion was ongoing. And like it shows up well into the 14th and 15th century and arguably today. People, if you go to, some of the sites where people discuss, the meaning of certain hadith and certain scholarly circles, people are really trying to understand, where does music fall within Islam? And the problem is that there is no mention of music in the Quran at all. And so where do you go for that?
Right. I'm going to ask you, we start with Jamila, who's a strong woman, who's obviously an independent, freed woman, who's through her talent for music, attained freedom and monetary wealth. But gradually, music becomes something for the slaves, and it's very closely connected with the courtesan culture, which also becomes a segue into prostitution. And that's how we see it by the later medieval period. Of course, these are sweeping generalizations, but there is a hint of that. How do you kind of reconcile this?
It is difficult. Courtesans exist in every culture. And the distinction between courtesans and prostitutes is prostitutes are paid for sex. Courtesans are paid for art. However, those lines are very blurry, right? You can have a artistic prostitute and you can have a courtesan that's basically selling intimacy. But music, art, poetry, that's the key. In the medieval Islamic world, we have enslaved concubines, the singing women. It's often translated as singing girl, but I prefer singing woman because they were not all girls. They're also not necessarily all women. And they were the highly skilled slaves. They came from all over the world, and they were very expensive. So mostly the wealthy and aristocratic classes could afford them, but there were houses where you could go hear them. So this elite group of courtesans called the Kian emerge, and they're there, but they really become prominent by about the 9th century. There's a wonderful book by Al-Jahiz called the Risalat al-Qiyan, which is the epistle on the singing women. And it's satire. Al-Jahiz was a wonderful satirical writer, but he provides a lot of information about the patronage of singing women and who the singing women were. And they were beautiful, enslaved women who were highly educated and skilled musicians. And as such, they could manipulate the men, and they did. So how much of that we know is, true? It doesn't really matter. We can't really, we don't have any definitive truth, but what we have are a lot of accounts of these singing women earning wealth, purchasing their freedom, buying their own singing women, training them, like Shamila, like Arib, who's another famous singing woman, and also training men as singers. So they were very important to the culture. There are also Jawari, who are also singing women. The term could be used interchangeably with Qiyan, but often Jawari are kind of this generic enslaved group. And they were more musical concubines. But the main factor between a Khian and a Jawari is that free women could also be called a Kena or a Khian. Only enslaved women are Jawari. And so Khian is a little bit like how geisha would be translated, or the Chinese ji, where they're an arts person. And so that's the courtesan distinction there. And so we're all still trying to, those of us who are intrigued by this history, are still trying to unravel these terms and understand how they're being used in the culture. It is, of course, illegal to prostitute your slaves in Islam. I mean, it's just a bad idea in general. But people would loan their singing women. They would go to houses where they could be heard and kind of get around that. And there's commentary about this. You know, it's kind of sleazy to buck the system that way.
Right. Tell me, while you talk about the courts specifically, what was music like for the masses, the poorer people out there on the street? Is there any reference to that? Because music, as you rightly point out, also gives us a peek into the social history. And that's a very important form of studying history, or essential form of studying history, I would say.
Yeah, of course, the elite classes are writing, they're sharing the history. I should also say that we have we have note of women writing books and books of songs. In fact, none of them are extant. So all of these stories about women in particular, they're all conveyed by male authors, but often lovingly. Like, oh, we love singing women, let's talk about them. And then there's also, oh, we hate singing women, let's talk about them. But the masses, we glean what they're doing often by treatises on purity and piety, where they're telling people, there's kind of like chicken soup for the soul and like what not to do to be, a good Muslim. And so we know that music was used at weddings, lamentation at funerals. People would play music on the road. They would just be, a lot of the early songs were thought to come out of, the merchant classes just riding a camel and they're bored. What are you going to do? You're going to sing. Work songs, lullabies. Women, of course, have carried music in terms of sharing epics and family stories for millennia. And so we don't have concrete records, but we do know that people were making music in the streets. Roving bands of drunks singing drinking songs, students misbehaving. Drinking parties would go to monasteries because they knew that the Christian monks had pretty good wine. And the kicker for this, of course, is that drinking is illegal in Islam. And so the entanglement of music, wine, women, and song is prevalent. And so the lower classes were, also completely complicit in this. And there were times when they tried to clamp down on music and get people to stop doing it. Didn't work. And so there are all kinds of injunctions about, well, if you don't want to hear music at a wedding, what do? Well, you don't go to the wedding. Do you smash a lute? Right?
There's something universal about this. How did Hinduism of this period consider music? Of course, Brian, in Hinduism, in the courts of the period, we have a lot of reference to music. I mean, you can't go to a temple and not see, right from the ancient times, you have all these women musicians and dancers in different poses, always in a sense, moving almost to music in the fresco. So music did play a very big role in Hinduism and in local cultures. In fact, we were just talking about the local cultures that we get access through the Puranic literature and how that got amalgamated into the mainstream Hinduism. But this is an interesting question, Lisa. How did the Indian subcontinent impact this? Because there was a lot of mobility across. And to be fair, India and Persia became the two epicenters. So there were the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, and at their prime, the three big pillars of the Islamic world, right? So, and there was a lot of mobility between them. So how did the Indian side influence what was happening in this region that you talk about?
So India had an enormous impact from a literary standpoint as well as a practical standpoint. There were texts, people were going to India and bringing back texts and translating them. Same thing with Persia. And so a lot of the music theory, philosophies of music, ways of thinking about music come from Greece, Persia, and India. And so Muslim philosophers and scholars were reading these texts, they were translating them. There were major translation schools in Baghdad, also in what was Andalusia in Spain. And they were translating Greek texts, Indian texts, Persian texts, and then integrating this information into Islamic history and philosophy. So from that standpoint, it was enormously important. Also, just the flow of intellectual culture. There were Indian intellectuals, Persian intellectuals. There was an anti-Persian movement for a while, and that's where it is speculated some of the satire of Al-Jahiz and others come from, and the censure against music, because people are like, all of these Persian intellectuals are in our court. They're diluting our brand, as it were. We got to get them out of here. And so there was this weird, interesting nativist movement of, Islamic culture for Arabs. I mean, I'm really generalizing, but that was happening in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. And of course, slaves. Indian women were prized. They were beautiful. They were talented. They came from a highly sophisticated culture. And so to have them in your, what later became called the harem was very important. And so Indian women, especially of the courtesan classes, if you read your Kama Sutra, they have up to 62 adornments, right? And qualities. And so people wanted that. This was highly valued. And they would then bear your children and they would teach them. Culture goes through the mother. And so we do know that was part of the influence. Absolutely.
There are two other questions, and a question that even I've been wanting to ask you. So Moti, thanks for this. Moti George has this question. In an earlier book discussion, we learned that there was a huge nomadic culture, and he's talking about Anthony Satton's book on the nomads, the conquerors of the world, so to say. Across Persia and Central Asia, nomadism and music have gone together all through, and it still does. How much influence did this have on Islamic music? Because the story of Islam is the story of these nomadic tribes, even the Mongols adopting Islam, right? I mean, across Turkmenistan or across Tajikistan and the entire belt. So how much of this nomadic influence do you see in the music of this area?
I would say it was huge. I mean, it was the original indigenous influence, not just in terms of carrying, music. I mean, people always share songs, even today, right? Our young people will hold up their smartphone and say, check out this Spotify. Back in the day, it would be somebody on a camel, everybody's camping for the night at the oasis, right? And sharing music. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the rhythm of movement influences music. Our environments influence the kind of music we make and what we find appealing in sound. And so some folks have speculated, and I don't know enough about this, and it's one of the things I want to learn more about, is just simple movement of the camel, how we walk, right? As a performing musician that plays early music, there was not a metronome. So how do you find a tempo? Well, you check your pulse or you walk. A lot of our Western music indications have to do with dance or movement. I think in terms of the poetics that, early poetry comes out of movement. I mean, the poetry itself reflects themes of movement. If you read, for example, like the Mu'alakat, you read Antar, Labid, you're reading this, journey of the nomad. And also when it's not just the movement, but when you rest, when you stop, the music changes, because no longer do you have that sway of the camel and the clopping of the feet, and you're keeping time with your instrument, your drum, or your voice. Now you're stopping. And the stop and start of nomadic life has a profound impact on both the sound and the shape of the music.
There is a related question that Arjun asked, any relationship between Islamic music and gypsy music? Because that's something that stays on, right? You have the belly dancers that you have in Dubai and all the commercial side of it. But there is that element of gypsy that stays on, irrespective of how harshly Islam looks at music, right?
Mm-hmm. And I don't know that. I've thought that. I was talking to a young scholar just yesterday about flamenco and the gypsy influence, and she's looking at lyric, and it's fascinating. I can't wait for her to finish her degree so I can read this book. We don't really know. And this is the flip side of the question about nomads, right? And because they do not leave a written record always, it is carried in the memory and in the body. And so, oral history is profound and important, but a lot of things are not written down until much later.
And the fact is, you don't have enough of this.
Right.
Whatever history is written by the formal elements, right? By the state or by the purveyors of the faith, not necessarily by the people on the street. And that's why it's so important to look at aspects like this. There are two questions on very interesting questions. Actually, I want to take this. The first is again by Moti George, who says, does the local Arab culture influence the suppression of music in the Islamic world? Because it's a little bit of a dichotomy. Because he explains, when you see the Sharia, there is a huge influence of the old Arabian social customs put in there. Did it happen in the area of music as well? And Rajita has another question. Is the ban on music in Islam ordained in the Quran and the Sharia? How does the Quran look at music? I thought I did hear you say that the Quran has no reference to music. So it's a bit of a issue there.
This is the question for the ages, right? Because it all comes down to what is there in interpretation. So there is no mention of music in the Quran at all. There is the injunction to say, recite beautifully. And it is important to say that, when we listen to Quran, right, we listen to beautiful recitation, also of sacred poetry, right? That is not music, right? It is recitation. And so, to somebody who might, in the West, for example, we might hear the call to prayer, we might hear beautiful recitation and go, that sounds like a melody, but it's not song. And so this distinction was made very early on because people being people were putting popular songs in the recitation of the Quran. And you read this in the sources. So people were taking liberties, but people were taking liberties in every religious tradition. So a lot of the concern about music that happens in the medieval is coming out of fear of foreign influence, diluting, the straight path, because the general populace is going to go, hey, cool, I really like this song. And then people are like, no, you really shouldn't be listening to that. And so all of these guides were coming out on how to be a good and pious person. But the only place where one can find information about music is in the hadith, or the traditions of the prophet and his companions. And so people had to be pretty nimble in how to interpret them, because not all of them are what are called strong or sahih. Many of them are weak or daif. And some of them come from some pretty scroungy chains of authority, but they're there. And they've been expanded and riffed and analyzed, and there are many different variations. And some are just vague. And so this is part of the deeper question. In some schools of jurisprudence within Islam, listening is okay. Certain forms of music are fine.
Right.
But in others, absolutely not. And so it's all over the map. And so even though we might see some kind of hardline decisions, that is coming from a very specific line of thought, not necessarily the totality of Islamic jurisprudence and scholarship.
That brings me to Rajita Shukla's two questions, both very interesting. First is she talks about Kurdish culture, which has a tradition of music and dance, and it's so close to Baghdad within Iraq that, again, there is this question of how did that, stand the test of time and the hand of orthodoxy, so to say. The second is that the Shias, as she's rightly pointed out, have lamentation music during Muharram. So again, there is music on. So the Shias are interesting because their trajectory is very influenced by the Persian court and the pre-Islamic Persian traditions. So I've always found that interesting, even in art and everything. So what would your answer to these two questions be?
So Kurdish music has not been studied enough, I think. And I certainly I had to really try to find some of those traditions. People will make music no matter what. And so my thinking is that, whenever a group is being oppressed or a form is being hidden, they're still going to do it. There's a wonderful story that shows, well, wonderful, it's kind of dark, that shows up in al-Masudi about one of the Abbasid caliphs who was very pious. And when he came to power, he banned music, made everybody pray 5 times a day. He lasted about 11 months. They took him out and put in somebody else because they wanted to have music and entertainments at court. Whether that's, apocryphal or not, it's kind of indicative of what was going on. At the heart of all of these issues, to listen, to play, who gets to play, what subcultures get to have their music, such as the Kurds, all comes down to power. And so music controlling the arts and controlling expression, and this is kind of back to my earlier point about how music is a social construct as well as a relationship. It is, how do you control people? You control expression, and you control, what they can express. And so if you're not a fan of music, well, at least you can redefine what music actually means. And the Shiite are also, that there's some wiggle room in there. And that actually, that very question, I think answers far better than I did, that the earlier question about, what about these sort of hardline questions? What about the local response to this question about music? And the answer is everybody had a different take on it, even today. And so even in places where music is not technically allowed by law, people are still listening to music. They're still making music. They're still finding ways to do it. And there are also people who say, no, this is not for me. And I respect all of those standpoints, actually. People have a right to not listen to music. People have a right to not listen to poetry. And, this is also that the question of how do we interpret faith throughout the ages, and how do we take our own, kind of a music positive perspective, in the West, and look at some of these texts. How do I set myself aside as a musician? And I read some of these things where they're saying music is very bad. Anybody who sings is a terrible person. I'm like, well, that could be true, maybe, but I have to put myself into that mindset and remember that this is one response, and a logical one, given the context of the time. So how do I interpret that? That's a big question.
Brian also has a question. He's referring to the point that we made about the terrible destruction of Baghdad in 1258 by the Mongols. His question is, did these Mongols leave anything in terms of a musical tradition originating from Central and Eastern Asia? Actually, Brian, that's an interesting question, and I would also like a shot at that, because what really happens is that they do destroy Baghdad, but very soon, in the next 100 odd years, they also turn to Islam. Mongols adopt Islam and usher in one of the most lucrative periods in the history of the Silk Route, because the threat of Mongols is gone and they have been tamed, so to say. They are now in positions of power, authority, and hence responsibility. There is relative peace across the Silk Route, and trade, in fact, thrives all the way from China to present-day Turkey and then beyond into Europe. So this is seen as a golden age. So do the Mongols get some of the Central Asian roots into the culture in the Islamic world, Lisa?
I would say yes. I don't know. And, again, because the Mongols didn't leave a major documentary record other than destruction, which arguably is a documentary record. They were also, of course, one of the legends of the destruction of Baghdad is the destruction of the library. And the 99, scholars, and this has been actually, there's kind of a great graphic novel series about this. Because what do you do when you want to destroy a culture? You burn the libraries and you kill the intellectuals. And the Mongols were really good at this, but they were also really good at taking what they wanted. And so they pulled in scholars. There's a famous story about the Mongols surrounding, I believe it was Damascus, and they send out Ibn Khaldun, the great sociologist, to go talk to them. And he's like, please don't destroy Damascus again. And they're like, okay. And so, so we have these stories about cultural exchange, but again, not a clear-cut imprint. But I would say anytime one force attacks another, invades another, colonizes another, enslaves another, or just simply moves in, there's always an exchange of culture. What that is in this particular case, I couldn't say, but I would say it would have to be there. It would have to be there in some form.
Influence would have had to be there beyond.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Lisa, before we wind up this discussion, I have to talk to you about something that you referred to, Umrao Jan, the great courtesan who's immortalized in literature and in movies. We've had some very big movies on Umrao Jan. You have a class on Umrao Jan, and our viewers would love to hear about it. Tell us about your take on that era, that golden era of music, and women like Umrao Jan who kind of stand out.
Oh gosh, yeah. I teach a class on courtesans, and we start with antiquity and we roll through into the 19th and 20th century, really. And and unpacking this idea of autonomous women that are not married, that have their own cultures. And along as I was preparing for that class many, many years ago, I came across Jan. Of course, I actually I should say, full disclosure, I love Bollywood movies. And so I've seen at least, two of the Jan movies. And I like the early one a little better, the 1987.
All of us do.
Just love it, love it, love it. And also the music is so incredible, right? The music, the dancing, what's not to love in that movie? But I came across this novel and I'm like, I have to learn more about this, because we know about the sacred courtesans in a lot of different cultures, including India. We know about the Ganika and the Tawaf. And so I teach this book in this class. And so we sort of get to know different courtesans, but also what makes a courtesan in different cultures. We, of course, talk about singing women. We talk about the floating world of Japan and the geisha, the Orion, the Teiyu. And to actually reclaim this idea of these women are just sex workers, because they're not. And of course, they exist in the Western tradition as well. And so I have the students read Jan, and often it's the first Urdu novel, right? And it's a terrific novel, and there's some great translations, and I'm always shifting because I do not read Urdu. Well, I can read it, but I don't know what I'm reading because I read Arabic. But the students love it. And we bring in the music. And when I have students who have a background in either India or Pakistan, they get so excited because they're reading something that they may not have known about, or is just something that represents also their culture and experience. And we have a grand time listening to this. I actually had one student who, in one class, she's now doing a PhD, she wrote a terrific paper on item songs in Bollywood and the figure of the courtesan in Bollywood, and presented at a national conference. It's brilliant. And so just as an outgrowth of this novel, and every time I read it, I learn something new. And there have been some really cool recent studies into the use of poetry, but also understanding courtesan culture, especially in India. And when I had the privilege of going to India a few years ago, and we went to Lucknow, and we went to one of these wonderful old palaces way out in the country. And I was standing in this large receiving room, and I got really excited because I'm like, oh, Rajan, this is where she would have danced. And so, for me, that was like a big woohoo moment. But I always am needing to learn more about this history. But that for me was sort of like the bookend of these singing women.
Right. You mentioned the first Urdu novel on Umrao Jan. I think we have a story on Live History India on it. I'm not too sure, but can you name the book? Because Brian wants to know, and he wants to possibly read it. So what is the book called? It is Umrao Jan.
It is Umrao Jan, and there are a number of very good translations.
Anything that you would recommend? Which one would you recommend?
I've only been able to successfully find one of the earlier ones. I believe the translator is David Matthews, and I'm sort of mentally looking behind me. I know it's in that bookshelf over there, because I always try to collect them. Part of my selection on different translations is if it's affordable for the students as well. But I'd be very happy if somebody wants to email me with like, hey, here's some things that you think I should read. But also if there's some books that I've mentioned or just sources, I'd be very happy to be in touch about that. And I can be a little more clear.
Right. Yes, the first Indian novel, we do have an article on it, Brian. It's called Umrao Jan Ada, the first modern Indian novel. So if you actually go on to Live History India, and just type in Umrao Jan on top in the search bracket. You will get the book, at least the article on the first Indian novel, first Urdu novel on Umrao Jan, and you will also get a reference to the book that Lisa is talking about. Lisa, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you today, and thank you so much for this discussion, for opening our world out there, because we love having people like you. At least I do, and I hope all the attendees do also, because it just is so interesting talking about history in different areas, different eras, because we do have a tendency to look very deep within in India, because we have so much of history. There's so much of ground to cover. Much of it hasn't been covered. So we really enjoy this conversation. I came across your book on Instagram, I think, and I reached out to Sushmita and the team saying that we must get Lisa because we know so little about it. So welcome to the LHI Circle family, and many, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who was listening today. I appreciate you and your questions.